Okay, so we're going to discuss a little
When you record, you have to remember to post it too. There's two-step
Oh,
process.
it's two steps. But you can't have. I did post last Tuesdays.
Oh,
Okay, you can't have step two without step one, right? One
yeah,
thing at
exactly.
a time.
Right.
Okay, so we're thinking about Balak, that weekly parsha. Balak hires Balaam to bless the Jews and to curse the Jews, and he ends up blessing the Jews. We have the transformation, very poetic. And especially when you come to poetry, you could think about there's different layers of understanding and layers of interpretation. You could start with the simple interpretation, and you can go to metaphoric and Kabbalistic, and there are many ways to read it, and sometimes the same verse. There are many ways to read the same verse. So I want to talk a little bit about one verse and sort of read it on multiple dimensions, where you have the simple interpretation, and then we could talk a little Kabbalistic and a little Hasidic, but it's also a very practical point. So I think it's interesting. And the starting point is that Balak shows up, and I'm sorry, Balak hires Balaam to show up and curse the Jews. And as we discussed on Tuesday, there are essentially three series of blessings, and the fourth is more like blessing slash prophecy about the distant future. So the first idea is sort of historic, looking back, giving the history of the people. The next series is more like current, the Jewish people sort of about to enter the land, and God's promise to allow them to enter the land and fulfill that promise. And then you have the third one is sort of the settling in the land more in the future. And then after those three, the Balak is upset that he blessed the Jews instead of cursing them. So he says, I'm going to send you back to your people. And here he says, okay, before I go back to my people, let me tell you what's going to happen in the future, meaning the distant future. And the distant future, as we discussed on Tuesday, could be King David, which was at that point about 400 years in the distance in the future, and then even more distant, the Messianic era. That's in a way, it's the most clearest allusion to Mashiach, as we discussed on Tuesday. So these are just very broad themes, and every clause and every phrase can be deciphered, even again from the pshat, from the simple meaning, from the interpretation, from the medrash, and Kabbalah and Hasidism. So we can really look at every phrase and elaborate. I think we'll start from one, and we'll start from the point where the first question is when you talk about a poem and you talk about metaphor, I guess the first question is this a metaphor? In other words, where does the metaphor start? Right? So if it's just prose, then you have one perspective. But if it's metaphor, you have another perspective. So the question is, where does the metaphor even start? So what do I mean? So I'm going to open up the parsha, we'll share the screen, and um, we'll look at the first series of blessings, and we're going to get into the discussion is what is the first, literally one of the first things he says, is it the actual blessing? Is it the introduction? And what's at stake is what is the meaning and what is the mystical meaning and the spiritual meaning. So we have what to look at. So I'm just going to share the screen. Okay, so I'll open the Rashi just for the fun. Okay, the Rashis get long when you talk about poetry because it's more than just a simple meaning. Okay, so I'm just going to read a little bit. So Balaam tells Balak, oh, you want to get me in the mood? If I want to prophesize, you got to build seven altars and you have to create seven offerings on seven altars. He's got his whole ritual. So let's read a little of the ritual to get us in the mood. This is Numbers chapter 23, verse 1. Balaam said to Balak, build me seven altars here and prepare for me seven bulls and seven rams. Balak did as Balaam had requested, and Balak and Balaam offered up a bull and a ram on each altar. Okay. Balaam said to Balak, remain next to your ascent offering, and I will go. I mean, I'll take a walk. I'll go find solitude. Perhaps God will communicate with me reluctantly, and he will show me something that I can relate to you. So he went alone. God communicated, okay, this is the translation. I don't love this translation, but okay. God communicated reluctantly with Balaam, who said to him, I have set up seven altars, and I have offered up a bull and a ram on each altar. God placed his message into Balaam's mouth. He said, return to Balak and speak thus. When he returned, he was standing next to his ascent offering together with all the Moabite dignitaries. He began to recite his parable, right? By Yisam Mishalo. He raised his parable. And that's actually a phrase that is stated in all four of the series of statements. It all starts by Yisam Mishalo. He began in parable. He's speaking in parable and said, Balak, the king of Moab, has brought me from Aram, from the mountains of the east, saying, come curse Jacob for me, and come invoke God's wrath against Israel. Okay? So he's telling the history. I was hired to come and curse the Jews. He continues, how can I curse when God has not cursed? How can I invoke God's wrath? God has not been angered. And then we get verse 9. For their, okay, this is terrible. I can't read this. I can't read this. This is Rashi. I'm going to open up the another translation. So this is I'm sorry for bothering everybody here. Numbers chapter 22. Yeah, 22. Okay, we're up to here. Oh, this is also mistranslates. My God. Okay. Let's look at Art Scroll. I'm desperate. Nobody translates this literally. It's unbelievable. Okay.
So has Russia built into the translation. It's also
Yeah, everybody has,
origins, not from the mountain
right,
top.
right. Also tests. Oh my, from the origins. My God. Okay, I can't get away from this. For from their beginning I see them as mountain peaks, and I behold them as hills. It is a nation that will dwell alone and will not be reckoned among the nations. And then he continues, who counted the dust of Jacob, or the number of fourth of or of the seed of Israel? May my soul die the death of the upright, and let me be like this, like his. And that's the first series. And of course, the king is very upset. He's like, Balak said to Balaam, what have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, but you have blessed them. I said, what can I do? I told you in the beginning, in the fine print in the contract, it said I could only speak what God says. He answered, saying, what the Lord puts into my mouth, that I must take care to say. Balak said to him, come with me to another place from where you will see them. However, you will see only a part of them, not all of them, and curse them from me from there. This is very interesting. When you see the whole people, there's no curse, only blessing. If you isolate a portion, there could be blessed, there could be curse. That's going to tie into what we're going to say in a minute. But the bottom line, going back to verse 9, literally, Meirosh Tsuri Marenu, I see them from the top of mountains, and I behold them from hills. But you know, Hebrew, May is from, Meirosh, from the top of mountains, I see them. And from hills, I gaze upon them. So the simple interpretation is clearly that Balaam is standing on top of a mountain, and that's why he could see the people. Why is this significant? It's significant because later the implication is, after this series, the implication is that Balaam, the Balak, the king, tells Balaam the prophet, I'm going to take you to another place where you can only see part of the nation. Now, the nation is hundreds of thousands of people. How could but the implication is that up until this point, he could see all of the people. How could you see hundreds of thousands of people if you're just standing in a plane? So the answer must be, as the verse states in verse 9, he was not standing on a plane. He was standing on top of a mountain. And if you're on top of the mountain, you look down, you could see hundreds of thousands of people. So many commentaries, not Rashi, surprisingly, because Rashi usually does stick to the simple interpretation, but many commentaries explain simply. Verse 9 means Balaam is standing on the mountaintop. Very simple, nothing more simple than that. And this is not a metaphor. This is just prose. I see them as mountain peaks. I see them from mountain peaks, and I behold them from hills. And that's the simple meaning. May Rosh, Migvaot, Mem is from. There's no way to do this. So that's the interpretation according to many of the classic commentators who are focusing on Pshat, the simple meaning. That includes Ibn Ezra, that includes Nachmanides, and others. Rashi usually sticks to the simple interpretation, but here Rashi deviates from the simple interpretation and looks for a metaphor. And Rashi is the one who influences all these translations that they already incorporate Rashi's interpretation. Rashi says, no, Rashi says mountains and hills do not refer to the place, the geography, the topographical place where Balaam is standing. Rather, it's a metaphor for our origins. Merosh. Merosh is the head, which is the origin, and it refers to patriarchs and matriarchs. In other words, you're looking at the people, you can look at the people and see them as who they are. But you could look at them as they're continuing a chain from the past. And that's, according to Rashi, what Balaam is saying. Yes, if you look at the individual person right now, maybe he's imperfect, but if you look at him as a chain, a descendant, someone who has the strength and the potential of the patriarchs, of course, then they're worthy of blessing. So that's what Rashi is doing, right? So if you look at Rashi in verse 9, for from its beginning I see them as mountain peaks. Of course, that's not what the verse says. The verse says, I see them from mountain peaks. But this translation is already affected by Rashi. Says Rashi, I look at their origins and the beginning of their roots, and I see them established and powerful like these mountains and hills because of their patriarchs and matriarchs. This is the Medrash. So in other words, a simple interpretation would be when Balaam says, I see them from mountain peaks. I behold them from hills. And again, he's been hired to come and curse the Jews, and he shows up and he sees all of the Jews. Like I said before, why? Why can't he? Why could he see all the Jews? Because clearly he's on the mountaintop. But yet Rashi follows the Medrash and says, no, this is not really prose. Don't think about that. He's saying, I am standing on the mountaintop, but rather this is a metaphor. And this is a parable. And he says that the parable is that I am standing on, that I'm looking at them, I see them not as who they are, in other words, only as who they are by themselves, but I see them as an extension of their patriarchs, the mountains and hills, which is patriarchs and matriarchs. Why is mountains and hills patriarchs and matriarchs? Okay, you can look at that, and if you look at the Medrash brings proof. There are many verses that use the patriarchs as the mountain, like because mountain is really where the stone, where the rock is hewn from, right? You want to make stone, you take it from the mountain. So that many of the prophets say, look at the rock where you have been taken from. So that's the standing metaphor. So just to summarize where we're up right now is there's a choice to read the verse as straightforward, where he's standing. There's a choice to look at it as metaphor, which is patriarchs and matriarchs. What we want to do, the roadmap for the future for the next few minutes, is to ask why Rashi chooses the metaphor and what does it mean? What is the Kabbalistic concept of a metaphor? What does this concept of metaphor tell us about the strength of the Jewish people collectively? And what does it tell us about might and strength in our own personal life? So this is sort of the entry point to very deep ideas. Go ahead, Bob, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. Maybe you can include in your discussion, I think there are only 6 portions in the Torah that actually ascribe the portion to a name of somebody, and quite often they're not favorable people. But probably never in the Torah is there a figure almost so much like Moses, in terms of their grandeur, their largesse, their wisdom. What is this doing in the middle of this book, insofar as his effect, it's almost the Antichrist. It's the other side of the coin. As influential as he is, he's never going to have a place in the world to come. As much as he wants to curse, he blesses. I mean, what about Balak and Balaam is doing in the middle of this book? You might just hit upon that.
So I think I'm going a little different direction. So maybe we'll take 120 seconds and talk about that, because that's a very important point. We have to address the big, I don't want to say the elephant in the room, but we have to address the big Big
The
idea
big
before you get
donkey in the room.
big donkey. Oh, that was good. That was good metaphor. Okay. Thank you, Bob. Okay, the big donkey in the room is as follows. Um, the question, this is a big story. You know, on Tuesday I set up the class, and the big question was seemingly this story is irrelevant to the Torah because it doesn't advance the plot. The Jewish people are already at the bank of the Jordan River. They are where they need to be. They already conquered the land east of the Jordan. You could have had the Torah seemingly would not be missing anything if this parsha was not here. Okay.
Correct.
So on the surface, you look at the story and say it's a detail that's not important. But if it's in the Torah and it's toward the end of the Torah, I know you don't think it's toward the end of the Torah. You're getting uncomfortable because the end of the Torah is after the high holidays and you still want to enjoy the summer. So you're like, we're only in the middle of the summer. Why are you talking to me about the end of the Torah? But in a way, it's the end of the Torah because remember, the Torah in a way ends at the end of the fourth book because the fifth book is repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in a way, this is the end. This is the culmination. The culmination is this. We're toward. In a way, we're at the Jordan River. We have to take care of some business in the next three portions, but we're already at the Jordan River. In a way, we finished the journey. We left Egypt. We're not going to go into Israel in the five books of Moses, right? That starts in the book of Joshua. So in a way, we're at the end. We're here. We're at the goal. Now, again, we have technical things to take care of in the next parshas. Fine. But in a way, it's the end of the story. It's the culmination. It's the climax. What is the climax? So now, if you think that the story of the Jewish people is only about the Jewish people, it's a particular story, then you don't need a portion of Balak. Who cares? What does Balak say? How did this Gentile think about the other? What did the one Gentile tell another Gentile about the Jews? Who cares? Okay. But if you're looking at the Torah and say, ultimately, yes, the five books of Moses many times is a story speaking to, it's a particular book talking to the Jewish people. God says to Moses, speak to the children of Israel, because many of the precepts are specifically for the children of Israel. But if you understand the purpose of the Torah, ultimately it's not only for the Jewish people. We talked about this on Sunday, about the idea of we're the firstborn son. We have to inspire everybody else. We're not the only son. We're not the only child. We're the firstborn child. It's a completely different story. So the point is, ultimately, the theme of the Torah is transformation, not just transforming the Jewish people, but transforming the nations around us and ultimately the entire world. If that's the case, then this is a story which hints to the idea, the optimism, that even the people ultimately who wanted to curse us will be transformed. It may take time, but it can only happen because it started happening in this parsha. That's the big idea. Now, specifically, we could talk about how much of the transformation affected Balak, how much Balaam, and what Balaam is a fascinating personality. We could talk about other aspects of his personality, but I don't want to do that right now. But I just suffice it to say that this parsha becomes critical in a way, the most important parsha, if you're looking from the perspective of the Jewish people's mission, not just for themselves, but for to transform the entire world. If that's the case, then this is the most critical parsha.
Got it. Got it. Because a lot of the metaphors that set up, I mean, when he was standing on a mountain, I almost said, oh gosh, this is a lookalike of Moshe on Sinai.
Yeah,
I mean,
yes.
all these
Moshe
little
Sinai and
metaphors
Moshe
have
at the end of his
echoes.
life. And
Yeah.
Moshe at the end of his life, because he's
Yeah.
looking into Israel too. Right.
Exactly.
Right. 100%. Balaam is complicated because on one hand, he's been transformed, but not completely. And he's like Moshe. But yeah, we could talk about Balaam, but I want to leave that alone for right now.
Okay.
Suffice it
Got
to
it. I
say
just wanted to clear that up.
yeah, 100%. But it's a big idea. This is not small. The idea of transformation, the idea of your enemy is going to bless. And the people who want to destroy you ultimately will make peace with you. Okay, so that is not a small theme. It's not a technical thing. So they won't fight us. So we'll be able to live in Tel Aviv, and the stock market will be able to go even higher because we're not going to be worried about missiles. Not that the stock market is low. The stock market in Tel Aviv is at all-time high. I don't know. It's just an amazing thing. But the bottom line is we want peace so that we can live in peace. No, that's not the goal. We want peace because the goal of creation is transformation, not just of the Jewish people, but the entire world. So in that sense, this story, even though it seems like it's a detail and does not advance the plot, in some ways, this is the plot. There's no other plot. This is the point. And that's why it's at the end, the culmination of the Torah. Because again, the end of the fourth book is the Torah. So we're not completely finished. We still have some business to take care of. But even the geographical journey, we left Egypt, we went through Sinai, we traveled through the desert, we're at the Jordan River, we're at the bank of the Jordan River, ready to cross. Now, this is a very important story. How do the people in the world see us? Maybe they hate us, but they will be transformed. Okay, that's big. Okay, let's go back to the mountaintop. So the question is, why is Rashi, who usually will take the simple interpretation. Why does he start talking about ideas of metaphor and say not that I'm standing on a mountaintop, which is exactly what the verse says, no other way to read it, May Rosh Tzurim, from the mountaintop. And why does he take metaphor and say, no, mountain is father's, and hills as mothers, and I'm looking at their strength, and I see their strength like hills and mountains from their parents. Why is he going there? Rashi should take the simple and straightforward interpretation. That's question number one. And we're going to give a technical answer. And after we give a technical answer, we're going to give a spiritual answer and a Kabbalistic answer. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I think it's a technical answer. Didn't it say at the beginning that it's all a parable?
Oh,
Even the 5-year-old can understand that if everything is a parable, even the 5-year-old can understand poetic metaphor.
So this is Vicky has the technical answer. Technical answer is that if you look, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at the beginning and it says, Vayisam Shalo, and he raised this parable, the problem with this series is that you could make an argument that nothing in this series is parable. The other series, everything is parable. It's always parable. Every single word out of his mouth, every clause is a parable. But in this series, in series number 1, you can argue that there is no parable. Maybe verse 10 is a parable, but probably not. If we had the time, you can get into it. So verse 7, 8, certainly most of 10, probably 10 also. I can make an argument that all of 10 is not a parable, and all of 9 is not a parable. So the problem is not that everything has to be a parable. The problem is that here nothing is a parable. Right? Verse 7, he took up his parable and he said, Balak, the king of Moab, has brought me from Aram, from the mountains of the east, saying, come curse Jacob for me, and come invoke wrath against Israel. That is not a parable. It's poetic. Instead of, he says, the mountains of the east, he repeats himself. He says, Jacob, and then he says, Israel. It's poetic, but it's not parable. And then verse 8, how can I curse him? God is not cursed. How can I invoke wrath if the Lord has not been angered? It's poetic. It's not a parable. And then verse 9, if you read it simply, from the mountaintop I see them, and I behold them from the hills. It is a nation that will dwell alone and will not be reckoned among the nations. Again, no parable. Who counted the dust of Jacob? So here it depends what you mean the dust of Jacob. But dust of Jacob, Rashi says it means the mitzvot that they do with the earth. If that's the case, it's not a parable. Dust is dust. May my soul die with the death of the upright, and let my end be like his. No parable. So the problem for Rashi is always looking for the simple interpretation. The problem for Rashi is that how could I say that this verse, I have to identify something in verse 7, 8, 9, 10 that's a parable. Because in the other series, there's so many parables. Here, there's no parable. But it says, Vayisam Shalo, he took up his parable. So we have to find the parable even in something that looks like prose. And therefore Rashi says, verse 9, from their beginning, not Meiros Tzurim Arenu, I see them from the mountaintops, but I see the top, I see their origin, and then they have the might of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and now the mountaintop is not a geographical place, but rather the mountaintop is a metaphor for might and strength that they get from the patriarchs and matriarchs. So that's the technical answer. But it's only a technical answer because it's not the deeper answer is going to have to be, why do you need metaphor? Why did he have to put in a metaphor? And why is the metaphor specifically this idea of patriarchs and matriarchs? And so we have to elaborate upon this. But that's a technical answer. Technical answer is even somebody like Rashi, who's always looking for the simple interpretation, must take something in this series and say, it's not simple, it's a metaphor. What does he do? He says it's the strength. Why? Because there has to be a metaphor here. Okay, now we're going to read the Kabbalah of Metaphor. The Kabbalah of Metaphor, first of all, Kabbalah of Metaphor, and second of all, what the specific metaphor that is being employed. Go ahead, Dr. John, please.
Sort of a strange question, Rabbi, but one of the beauties of seeing this on Zoom is that I can use Google and look things up.
Oh, good.
Looked up parable.
I hope I'm saying the truth. Yeah.
No.
I'm kidding.
This intrigued me because I never thought about it this way before. The definition says parables are generally fictitious. Is this parable fictitious or not?
No. I wouldn't agree with that. I have Vicky
Well, that's
here.
what if you look. That's the definition.
Yeah. No. I would say parable. It depends on you by fictitious. I I would be now. I don't know if I agree with that. For example, if I want to say the example I would bring is the next series when he says the war in Israel now is called Heinam Kalavi Akum. A nation will stand up rise like a lion. Right. So it comes from Balaam's words in this week's parsha. He says, Hein Am Kalavi Akum, a nation will rise like a lion. Right. So let's see the next series. Hey, now, verse 24. Behold, a people that rises like a lioness and raises itself like a lion. Okay, that is a metaphor. Of course, it's fictitious in the sense that the Jews are not a lion. The Jews are people. But the metaphor is, could you find something in nature that will express this abstract idea, right? The abstract idea is strength. But how do you speak about strength? You take something that everybody could see and everybody knows about, and it's a symbol. So I would say more of symbolism, but again, symbolism you can argue. I'm not disagreeing with the dictionary, but in a way you can argue that symbolism is fictitious. But symbolism is more complicated, at least in my mind. Vicky will give us a professional view, but for me, it's fictitious in the sense that it's not a lion, but it's symbolism in the sense that something we can use it sort of as a borrowed term. That's what I would say.
But Rabbi, is the Bishop for Vicky, is the story of Balaam fictitious, or is that a
Oh, that's a different story. Oh, very good, very good, very good. Okay, that's a different story. You're asking, is the whole story fictitious? Oh, very good. So the problem with the story of Balaam is it's a very strange story. There's a talking donkey, and Balaam hits his donkey, and the donkey opens up its mouth and talks. So it's just a strange story. So I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe that Maimonides says that whole story with the talking donkey is just in his dream. So it's not fictitious, it's a dream, because it says that he went to sleep. It doesn't say he woke up. Actually, it does say he woke up. But the point is, it says he went to sleep. So Maimonides says, if I'm not mistaken, Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed, if I'm not mistaken, says, and maybe wrong, but I think he says that this is all in a dream. But that's only the parts that make no sense, the talking donkey. But the part that he actually showed up and spoke these words, that there's no reason to assume is, even according to Maimonides, there's no reason to assume that didn't happen, right? Because, yeah, there was a king who was afraid of the Jews. He hired the Jews. He hired the guy to curse the Jews. That's not unreasonable, right? Maimonides' view is that when something in the Torah seems unreasonable, it could be a metaphor unless it's not, unless you know for sure it's not, unless it's relevant to the plot. So I would say that the story as a whole happened, but some of the more incredulous parts of the story, like the talking donkey, may have not happened. That may be part of a dream. Now, go ahead, Vicky. Give us something on metaphor.
Well, if you read the Torah, it's all like metaphorical, and that's what makes it so significant. And they say that there are 70 layers on each interpretation for each verse. So the metaphor doesn't make it fictitious in a practical sense. It maybe does, but it deepens the understanding. But my question was, that specifically that particular verse 7 says that you have to interpret as a parable. Other than this parsha, does anyone in the Torah it points that you have to look for deeper meaning? Because we do look for deeper meaning, and we do know that there are 70 layers, but I think it's only in this parsha, right? Because it's so metaphorical, and it's so important for existence of Jewish nation, and how the other people will recognize whether that comes from Hashem, whether we need something to transform the other nations. It's all remains to be determined.
Yeah, I do think that you're right. This is the only place in the Torah. Torah uses the term mashal, parable. So sometimes the Torah uses poetry, and whenever you're going to introduce poetry, there is going to be some metaphor. Right? You're going to say, for example, the Song of the Sea, that the Egyptians drowned like a stone in deep water. Okay, they were not like a stone, but it's like a stone. So you have poetry. It's not the only place of poetry in the Torah. There's later in the Torah, in the last day of Moshe's life, he talks about, for example, how the soul is a rope connecting the person to God. So you do have metaphors, but this is the only place where it actually says the word parable. It says mashal, parable. I think is the only place in the Torah where it actually says we're a parable. But thinking in hindsight, the blessings of Jacob, the blessings of Moshe always employ parables. Like they talk about Judah as a lion, and Benjamin as a fox, and Naphtali as a gazelle, right? They're always talking about metaphors. So metaphor is not the only place that metaphor is used, but it's the only place that it actually uses the term metaphor, mashal, metaphor, or parable. So we'll talk about that in a minute. I just want to say that this is not related to what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I was reading about, I forget the person's name, but he's a historian and a scholar about language from Harvard. I forget his first name, but I forget his last name also. But he was giving a lecture and I was listening to it, and he was saying that why is it that the writing a few hundred years ago, the writing of the great European writers seems much more vivid, as opposed to, he has this whole thing against academic writing. Academic writing is boring and it makes it actually harder to understand. But if you go back to the great scholars in the past, just a few hundred years ago, they're writing very vivid, and everything they're writing comes to life. And he says like this, it's a very interesting thing. Everything, ever since I hear it, I can't stop thinking about it. He says, today we have language to explain abstract concepts. So we create terms to explain abstract concepts. He says 500 years ago, there were far fewer terms to explain ideas. So if you wanted to explain an idea, you had to use a metaphor from nature. You had to say they rise like a lioness and they stand up like a lion to mean strength, because there weren't as many words to quantify different, scientific terms for strength. Yes, Steve Pinker. Yes, thank you. Steve Pinkner. Yes. Thank you, Ben. So that's what he was saying. And ever since I said that, in the Torah, you see it. It's like unbelievable. Like it always falls back to metaphor, and it's so vivid. And part of that is that he's saying, I'm going to give the Kabbalistic interpretation, which we'll see in a minute. But the scientific interpretation is simply the language is not developed to the point where you can create academic terms, which makes then for boring language, right? You have to look for things that are vivid and people can relate to in nature. And if you'll do that, yes, it becomes real. And that's the beauty of a metaphor, and even poetry till today, where it makes things real and concrete. And we have a way, we're physical people, we have a way of being moved and steered by not so much the abstract concepts, but by things that are concrete. So that's the scientific interpretation of why we would use a metaphor. And now I'm going to get into the Kabbalistic interpretation of why you would use a metaphor, and specifically why the metaphor is employed in this verse of this whole series. Only verse 9 has metaphor, and we're going to get to why that is. So I didn't mean to be a Kabbalah of metaphor, but it turns out that it's going to be not only Kabbalah, but it's the science and the Kabbalah of metaphor. Okay. So after this, we're going to have the poetry class at 11 o'clock. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Okay, so let's just put it out here. We don't have that all that much time. I feel like a real rabbi. 40 minutes is the introduction. Now we could start talking. Okay. This is from an essay of the Rebbe, beautiful essay. We can read the end of it in English. We don't have to get to the technical part. We already did the technical part. The essay is like this. When do you use metaphor? You use metaphor when your audience, so Steve Pinkner says they use the metaphor because you have no other language and you want to bring it to life, but that's true. But let's go a deeper level. You're going to use metaphor when the people, your audience, are not going to understand, will not have direct experience of the idea you're trying to convey. They don't have direct experience. So you have to borrow, and in that sense, Dr. Tamarin's quoting from the internet is true. It's fictional because it's fictitious. It's not 100% true. You're borrowing a term that people do understand. In other words, let's say you're talking to a primitive people and you want to describe the might of the United States Army. And you're going to say, we have nuclear energy, nuclear warheads. We have nuclear power. People don't understand what that means. So they don't have direct experience in what you're trying to say. So you say, you know what? A lion, you understand. The might of a lion, you understand? Okay, say the United States is as mighty as a lion. Oh, now we understand. Now, do they understand? They don't understand. Because they don't fully understand. They don't have direct knowledge in what the might of the United States is. They don't understand. They don't have the capacity to understand the complex science of nuclear power. But they understand lion. So in that sense, it is fictitious. So I'm going back. I accept it. It is fictitious, right? But why is it employed? It's employed because the people, when your audience will not have direct experience or direct insight into that which you're trying to explain, then you have no choice but to borrow a term and say, yeah, this is might, but I'm going to use a metaphor from a lion as an example. So now let's talk about this for a second. Balaam is coming and he sees the might of the people. Remember, just to get a little poetic, going back to just to ground it in the parsha, it says the king saw that the Jewish people are many, and there's too many of them, and that's why he's afraid. So he hires the Gentile prophet to come curse the Jews. When the Gentile prophet shows up, part of what he says, at least according to Rashi, is their strength is not the physical numbers. Their strength is a spiritual strength. You don't, in other words, you're afraid of them, but you're afraid of them for the wrong reason, because they're not the biggest people, right? If you want more people, you go, there's many people have more. We're not the most numerous nation. In fact, in Deuteronomy, it says God chose us specifically not because we're the most numerous of all nations, but because we're the smallest nation or smaller nations. I had a friend who can't understand how come we don't go to China and convert everybody and boost our numbers by 1 billion, and then it will be safe. That's what he says. He keeps telling that to me. I say, I don't know, maybe not. He says, no, but that's what we got to do. So, because that comes from the perspective that the numbers is your strength. But Balaam here is saying, in other places in the song, he says that's not their strength. So Balaam is talking to his audience, who's Balak, and Balaam is a spiritual man, so he understands this, or maybe understands it. We'll talk about that, whether or not he himself understands. But he understands enough to know that I do not understand the strength of the Jews. And that's why I have to use a metaphor. I can't say they're mighty. I can't say that, because that will imply that my audience, that they could speak about the might of the Jews directly because they understand the might of the Jews. But if I employ metaphor, then the first indication of metaphor is that when you use a metaphor, you're telling me, Menachem, you don't really understand this. You don't have firsthand knowledge. You have to borrow a term. So when the prophet Balaam tells me that the might of the Jews is like mountains, so in some ways it's indicating to me and telling me, it's giving me some information. But even before that, it's telling me, ladies and gentlemen, you don't understand the might of the Jews. And therefore, we have to bring a metaphor. So that's step number one. And that's a very deep concept, because we'll talk about what is the might of the Jews and why Balaam, certainly his audience and probably himself, is not capable of understanding the might of the Jews. But before we even get to that, we have to just establish this point that we have to establish the point that metaphor is an indicator. When you hear metaphor, it's telling you you do not understand that you don't have direct experience with this phenomenon. And therefore, we're making a metaphor. In other words, not just to make it more vivid, not just to evoke something very primal within yourself because we're moved by physical phenomenon. That could be true. But from the mystical perspective, metaphor means you have no way of experiencing this directly. I'm in pain. You cannot feel my pain. So I have to say something else. I have to say whatever a metaphor I employ. Same thing here. Balaam wants to talk about the Jewish people's strength. He cannot talk about it directly because his audience and maybe even he cannot fully understand it. Okay. Certainly spheres are used metaphor in Kabbalah. Yes. So Kabbalah uses metaphor all the time. And the danger of Kabbalah is to think that you understand the metaphor, right? And the premise is that if it's a metaphor, you don't understand it. In other words, God is more abstract. In other words, the metaphor is just a way to explain to you something that you have no way of experiencing. And God is removed. And God, so there's two. First of all, the Sfirot are not God. They are God's expressions of God. That's one point. But another point is the whole idea of Kabbalah, the whole idea of metaphor is that you don't understand it. Now, you could read the metaphor and say, oh, I read the metaphor. I know what it is. I know what a lion is. Going back to my metaphor, I know what a lion is. So I know the United States is as strong as a lion. So I know all I need to know about their might. So what do I have to do? I have to come with 2 lions. I'll overtake them. That's a mistake because they're not lions. They're a nuclear power, right? But if you think you understand the metaphor, you're in trouble. So that's the danger of Kabbalah, to try to think that because I understand the metaphor, I understand the full thing. So you're right. Great observation. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, we use the words metaphor and parable interchangeably, although they are different. The parable is an example that it's translated here as a parable. Specifically, that's something that even child can understand.
Right. But a child doesn't understand fully. So, for example, if you want to say that you want to tell a child, that God is all powerful. Okay, you can't understand. Child doesn't know what all powerful is. So what do you say? You say what Moshe tells what God tells the Jewish people as a metaphor in the book of Exodus, that what God will take the Jewish people out of Egypt with a strong hand. Okay, a strong hand the child can understand. But the child understands what a strong hand is, but a child does not understand that this is the analog, what the might of God is, because might of God is not expressed with the strong hand. But because you don't understand, and there's no way for you to understand the might of God, so you say, look, you have a small hand, and you could throw a 3-pointer, so you have some might. So God has a very big hand. How big? As big as the whole Pacific Ocean. So that's a metaphor, but of course that's not telling. In a way, it's fiction. It's fictitious. In a way, it's nonsense. But in a way, it's bringing you closer. But my point is just a premise. If you have to employ a metaphor, that itself is an indicator that you do not have direct knowledge of the analog. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, but then the question is, who is this metaphor is addressed to?
So we'll get to that. So this is just step one. We still have to do at least one step, and then things fall into place. Go ahead, Dr. John, please.
Rabbi, I was going to say that metaphors and parables essentially appeal to the emotions, not to reason.
Okay,
and
so
although they're very appealing, and Vicky talks about children, and basically, I suppose the average American voter is a child who is drawn by emotion rather than reason. The essence of Judaism is highly cerebral, and therefore, how do we link together this emotional appeal of parable and metaphor with a rational understanding of the truth?
Very good, very good, very good. So I agree that emotion, but I agree that emotion that a parable has an element of evoking emotion, right? And that's what poetry is so good at, because we have ideas of what love is and what pain is and what happiness is. But you read a poem and it's amazing because you analyze and say, I know I was moved by this poem. I don't know how, right? But that's the secret of metaphor. Metaphor has a way of touching you. Because we are physical people, we have a way of being moved emotionally from metaphor. So I agree. But you're also saying that it could be a distraction, and you could use it to evoke emotion, and that could be inconsistent with the intellectual and objective perspective. That could be, but not all. But emotion, but it doesn't have to do that, right? So I'm going to try to give the Kabbalah of metaphor and see how it would just be. The emotional stirring would be the first step to explore greater truths. So I guess the answer is, are you stopping at the emotion? Are you stopping at the metaphor? Just like I said about the Kabbalah, the danger of the metaphor is when you think that the metaphor is all that's there. The metaphor is supposed to be an invitation to say, explore further and think more abstractly. So just like in the Kabbalah is dangerous when you say the metaphor of God and you think that's what God looks like. So in your example, if you're using a metaphor to evoke emotion, then if it stops at that metaphor, you may be trying to manipulate people and distract them from their objective perspective. But if the metaphor is an invitation to say, look, let me give you a little taste. Maybe you don't understand what I'm trying to say, but maybe this metaphor would sort of be an invitation to explore further. Then the metaphor is a introduction. But there is an interesting point. I'm getting distracted now, but I can't hold myself back. The Kabbalah, Hasidic philosophy talks about the difference between a metaphor and a riddle. And it's both are conveying a deeper truth. But they each have an advantage and a disadvantage. For the purpose of our discussion, when you see a riddle has no knowledge, has no logic. The question has no logic. So when you hear a riddle, you know that there's a hidden truth, and that's the advantage of the riddle. The disadvantage, the metaphor, by contrast, is a disadvantage of the metaphor. The disadvantage of the metaphor is sometimes you could see the metaphor and not know that there's an analog, not know there's a deeper truth. I tell you a story. It's a nice story. It's really an invitation to explore further. But with a riddle, you know you can't sleep because you have to break the riddle. You have to crack the code. A metaphor, you also have to crack the code. But the danger of the metaphor is that sometimes you don't know that it's a code, and you think it's because it's a self-contained story. right? So it's interesting. Is this world, when we look at the world, is the world a metaphor or is it a riddle? If it's a riddle, we want to crack the code and say, what could we learn? What could we think? What could be derived from this truth? But if it's self-contained, you say, okay, everything is fine. Science is a parable. It's a parable to God's wisdom. But is this the whole story or is there more? So I think that's fascinating to contemplate. Okay, we have to come full circle. What is the idea here? Balaam cannot understand, or certainly cannot communicate. His audience cannot understand. Is tzimtzum a metaphor? What causes the metaphor? What is required for our beginning of understanding? Tzimtzum is a metaphor because tzimtzum by definition means contraction. But before there could be metaphor, there has to be an other, right? There has to be an other. The whole idea here is that before the tzimtzum, all you have is the oneness of God. And if there's oneness of God, all there is oneness. When there is an other, then there's the problem, could the other understand me? But if there's no other, then there's no purpose of a metaphor, because metaphor would mean, how do I explain to an other what I am feeling, right? Let's say you're in a relationship and I say, I feel something. Now I have to figure out, how do I convey to the other person how I'm feeling? And either I can speak about it directly or indirectly, or I need to hire a middle person or a therapist to figure out how to convey what I feel. And sometimes I don't even understand what I feel. I just feel it, but I can't verbalize it. But all this is just a process of, how do I convey it to the other? But within self, if there's, the truth of the matter is, within self, I also have to do that, because sometimes there's different dimensions of self. There's a conscious and subconscious, and sometimes I myself do not understand what I'm feeling. So I need to metaphor to explain to myself. But that's all because we're not real oneness. We're composite. We have many different dimensions within ourselves. But if you go back to the source and there's only oneness, there's no duality, then it's self-contained and it's self-knowing, and there's no barrier that you have to overcome to convey to the other. So tzimtzum is a way of making space for another perspective. Once you make space for another perspective, now you have to come up with terminology to try to explain to the other how you feel, to try to introduce to the other your own perspective. And sometimes vice versa, and the other person has to introduce to you their perspective, right? So I would say that only happens once you go beyond the oneness. And that's why in the Kabbalah, the source of everything is no tzimtzum. The source of everything is oneness. Then you have tzimtzum, and then you have to start talking metaphors. Okay, let's get to the point here. The point here, well, not the point, a point that we want to talk about is the Jewish people. The Balaam cannot understand the strength of the Jews. Why? And therefore he has to employ metaphor. What is the strength of the Jews? So if you ask the anti-Semites, what is the strength of our Jews? What do you mean? We control all the media, we control all the banks, and we control all the assets, right? You know the famous story. The famous story is that the Jewish people, two Jewish people are riding on the train in Western Europe before the war, and one is reading the Jewish newspaper, and the other is reading the Nazi paper. So they say, the Jew said, why are you reading the Nazi paper? He says, I'll tell you what. I read the Jewish paper, and all I hear is all the tsaris. We're so pained, we're prosecuted, we have so much tsaris. I read the Nazi paper. We control the world, we control the press, we control the media. It's amazing. So that's the joke. But what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say people think of strength in the form of material strength, in form of assets, of existence, of more existence. The more existence you are, the stronger you are. Right? The more assets you have, the more intelligence you have, the more resources you have, the more wisdom you have, the more persuasive you are. It doesn't really matter. You can all categorize that in what the Kabbalah calls yesh, existence. That is not the Jewish strength. I mean, we may have that, we may not have that, it depends. That's not our strength. Our strength is the opposite. Our strength is humility. Our strength is the ability, the sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. And from the perspective of Balaam, maybe Balaam senses it, but certainly his audience does not. And he says, there's no way I could convey to them what the Jewish strength is, because the Jewish strength is counterintuitive. When are you at your strongest point? You're at your strongest point when you're willing to sacrifice for something greater than self, right? No matter how big you are, how strong you are, if ultimately you say, I just want to protect my assets, I want to protect myself, then you're always vulnerable, because all you're trying to do is defend yourself. But if we're a people that we have the ability not just only to celebrate what we have, but if it comes to it, we want to say we can be devoted to something beyond ourselves. Ultimately, that's our true strength. Ultimately, that's why we've lasted 3,000 years. because we're not only interested in survival of self, we're interested in perpetuating something greater than self. And ultimately, that's your biggest strength. And we could read the essay inside, but I'm going to talk about it within ourselves, in our own relationships. What is strength? You know, people want to be, I want to lead, I want to be strength, I want to show my children or my family, I want to be a symbol of somebody who is strong and takes responsibility. What is strength? So strength can be to allow my perspective to dominate. That's conventional strength. But spiritual strength is the opposite. Spiritual strength is being able to go beyond myself for the sake of someone else, go beyond myself for the sake of something greater than self. And that is the meaning of conveying strength. And that is the meaning of the strength that the audience of Balaam, and maybe even Balaam himself, cannot understand. And that's why they have to speak in the terms of a metaphor. Because the people are strong like a mountain. What is their strength? I can't grasp it, because it's intangible and it's illogical. Because logic says I want to defend myself, self-perpetuation. And every created thing wants to perpetuate itself, and that's fine. The strength of the Jew, and we say we get it from our fathers and mothers, because the Tanya talks about this at great length in chapter 18, that we're descendants of the patriarchs and matriarchs. The definition of patriarchs and matriarchs is they give to us their ability to go beyond themselves for something greater than self. And that is the gift we have, and that is the secret of our strength, and it can't be quantified. Because if you want to quantify the strength of somebody, you talk about what they have. But that's not our true strength. Our true strength is never what we have. Our true strength is the fact that we could transcend ourselves and go deeper and be devoted to something beyond ourselves. And if you have that strength nationally and personally, then in a way you're the strongest you can be, and people cannot really quantify you, because most people don't have direct access to this type of strength. So I think this is very powerful. We can expand and we can read the essay inside, but I think for right now, this may be enough, something to think about, and think about in our own life, right? You know, it says, like in the Ethics of the Fathers, it says, "Ezeu gibor hakovesh et yitzro." Who is someone who is strong? Someone not who can fight everybody else, but can overpower their own inclination, right? That's chachma. And also, the Kabbalists talk about this. If you want to talk about, Dr. Joe's going to want to hear Kabbalah. You have chachma bina, wisdom, understanding. Understanding is the left side, is the ability to quantify that which I know and amass knowledge. I'm amassing bina. I'm amassing understanding. And that's what he says about Gvaot, the hills. But the mountains, which are stronger, which are higher than hills, according to the Kabbalah, is chachma, is wisdom. And what is wisdom? Not the quantification of what I know, but the ability to see and sense that there are things that I don't understand, to be able to maintain the wonder to that which is beyond myself, and realize that it's a metaphor and have to keep growing. So Chachma Bina has that same dynamic of understand. The left side is Bina, understanding, which is existence, and Chachma is the ability to see beyond my own perspective. And ultimately, who's stronger? Not the expert who says, I know everything, but the person who says, I can go beyond my perspective. I could see someone else's perspective. I could see a new paradigm that's beyond my own. That's Chachma. That's mountains. That's patriarchs. Opposed to the matriarchs is Bina. So you have Chachma, Bina. Both are more objective than emotion, but within the two, Bina is the sense to try to understand. But ultimate wisdom and ultimate strength and ultimate wisdom is the ability to see beyond my own perspective. And that opens me up to the true strength. So ironically, the true strength is humility. And it applies in every field. Who's more successful? The person who's not afraid to fail. If you think about it in a second, it's counterintuitive, right? If I'm not afraid to fail, means I'm not afraid of harming my ego. And if I'm here to protect my ego, my existence, I'm actually limiting myself. But if I could transcend myself and be vulnerable, I'm not afraid to harm my ego because I'm humble. It's not about me. It's about the mission that has to be done. Then ironically, I'm stronger than the person who's focused on their own existence and afraid to take risk and afraid to bruise their own ego. So there are all different ways of thinking about this. But the point is that counterintuitively, the more humble you are, the stronger you are. And that's counterintuitive, at least for the West, at least for Balaam's audience, and maybe even for Balaam himself. Okay, go ahead, Vicky. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. We have a psychiatrist on the call, and
yes,
speaking of conscious. It doesn't probably even matter whether Balaam understands what he's saying or not. The question is whether we understand it years later.
I think Balaam senses that there's something that defies the regular quantification. Every nation, if you want to quantify the map, if you want to quantify the strength, you make a spreadsheet and you put down their resources and assets, and then you can figure out what's going on. The Jewish people, you can't, because the measure is not quantifiable. The ability to self-sacrifice, the ability to transcend is not quantifiable. Reminds me of it's not a good metaphor, but it's a metaphor anyway. In the 6-Day War, the Arabs were saying that it must be that there were American and British Air Force helping Israel's Air Force. That's what they said. And people thought that that's propaganda, that the Egyptians didn't believe it. But the reality is, and then they realized that the Egyptians do believe it. Why? Because when the Egyptians are thinking about Air Force, you think about how many planes you could have and how many attacks you can do per hour. Okay. But what they didn't quantify is that Israel perfected the system so that every plane only has to be on the ground a third of the time that other air forces. So Air Force is not about how many planes you have, but it's how many planes you have plus the time that you can get it up into the air, right? So in other words, if a certain measure is not quantifiable because you don't understand it, then you misunderstand the might of the other people. So this is a metaphor for what I'm trying to say is that you can quantify, you could sense that they're super powerful. We don't know how, we don't know why. The answer is because it's the spirit, and the spirit of being able to be dedicated to something greater than self. And if you want to read about this, you can just turn on the news and look at people in Israel who are transcending themselves and going to and volunteering for the army for something like 300 days or more. And these are just people who have lives and bills to pay, and they're really putting themselves aside for the nation. And people wouldn't think that that's possible in the 21st century, where everybody is where everybody is self-oriented. But this is something that even Israel itself was surprised about, and it's not quantifiable because it's the ability, you can't quantify the ability to go beyond the self, the ability to transcend, because there's no way. It's humility. It's not tangible. You can quantify tangible assets, but the intangible and the ability to become intangible, the ability to transcend the physical, that's inquantifiable. So you want to talk about it. So Balaam senses there is a strength here. I just don't know what it says. You know what? We'll use a metaphor. Now, it could be he understands this, but his audience doesn't. But you're right that the true audience of this is us. And that's why we read the Torah, to remind us of what's happening and how to think about self. Self, our might, is not only what we could do and we could understand, but it's the introducing the concept of chachma, of wisdom, of seeing the ability to see beyond the self, the ability to transcend the self and connect to others and connect to something greater than self. And ultimately, that's what allows us to build and last and succeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is beautiful. Thank you all for joining. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbat. And we should see each other in good health. Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you.